I never thought my Tuesday evening backyard gatherings would turn me into the most talked-about person in Riverside Heights, Colorado. But here we are, and I have a 47-year-old woman named Patricia Whitmore to thank for that distinction. My name is Nathan Daniels, and I moved to this planned community just outside Boulder about 8 months ago after landing a remote software engineering position that finally gave me the financial breathing room to buy my first house. The place was perfect. 3 bedrooms, a decent-sized backyard, mountain views, and most importantly, a beautiful stone fire pit that the previous owners had installed. I fell in love with that fire pit during the walkthrough, already imagining cool evenings with friends, the smell of wood smoke, and the peaceful crackle of flames under Colorado's massive sky. The first few weeks after moving in were the usual chaos of unpacking, arranging furniture, and meeting neighbors. Most people were friendly enough, the kind of polite waves and brief conversations you expect in suburbia. The house to my left belonged to an elderly couple, the Hendersons, who kept to themselves but always smiled when we crossed paths. To my right lived a young family with 2 kids who were usually too busy wrangling their energetic children to do more than shout quick hellos. Then there was Patricia. I first encountered her on a Saturday morning while I was mowing my front lawn. She appeared at the edge of my driveway wearing white capri pants, a floral blouse, and sunglasses that probably cost more than my first car. Her hair was that specific shade of blonde that comes from expensive salons, cut in what I can only describe as the "I need to speak to your manager" style that has become iconic on the internet. "You must be the new owner," she said, not as a question but as an accusation. I turned off the mower. "That's me, Nathan Daniels. Nice to meet you, Patricia Whitmore. I'm the HOA president." She didn't extend her hand. "I wanted to personally welcome you to Riverside Heights and remind you that we have very specific community standards here. I noticed your trash cans are visible from the street. According to Section 12, Paragraph 4 of our CC and Articles, all trash receptacles must be stored out of sight except on collection days." I blinked. "It's collection day today, that's why they're out." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Collection is completed by noon. It's now 12:15. They should have been returned to your garage by now." This was my welcome to the neighborhood. Not a plate of cookies or even a handshake, but a lecture about 15 minutes of trash can visibility. I should have recognized this as the warning sign it was, but I was still in the honeymoon phase with my new house and neighborhood. I just smiled, said I'd remember that for next time, and assumed that would be the end of it. I was so incredibly wrong. The fire pit gathering started innocently enough. I invited a few friends over one Friday evening in late September. Nothing crazy, just 4 guys from my old college days who I hadn't seen in months. We grabbed some burgers from the grill, popped open some beers, and settled around the fire pit as the sun went down. We talked, laughed, told old stories, and generally had the kind of relaxed evening that makes you remember why you bought a house in the first place. Around 9:30, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Patricia Whitmore, HOA president. Your gathering is creating excessive noise. Please keep it down or move inside." I looked at my friends. We weren't being loud. We were just talking at normal conversation volume, the way people do when sitting around a fire. Sure, there was occasional laughter, but nothing that would qualify as a disturbance. It was 9:30 on a Friday night, not 2 in the morning on a Tuesday. I texted back, "Sorry, we'll keep it reasonable. Thanks." We did lower our voices a bit after that, but honestly, we hadn't been yelling to begin with. The evening wrapped up around 11, everyone headed home, and I thought that was that. The next morning, I found a formal letter from the HOA in my mailbox. It was printed on official letterhead and signed by Patricia Whitmore in her capacity as president. The letter informed me that I was in violation of Riverside Heights Community Covenant Section 8, Paragraph 2, which stated that outdoor gatherings creating noise disturbances after sunset are prohibited without prior written approval from the HOA board. I read that sentence 3 times. Noise disturbances after sunset. That seemed incredibly vague and restrictive. Sunset in September was around 7. Was I supposed to get written permission to have friends over in my own backyard? I decided to call Patricia directly. The number was listed at the bottom of the letter. She answered on the second ring. Patricia Whitmore. Hi, Patricia. This is Nathan Daniels. I got your letter this morning about last night, and I just wanted to clarify what exactly the issue was. We really weren't being loud. Mr. Daniels, I could hear you clearly from my house, which is 3 doors down. That constitutes a disturbance. We were just talking, at normal volume. It was barely 9:30. The rules don't specify a decibel level, Mr. Daniels. They specify that noise disturbances are not permitted. I found your gathering disturbing. Therefore, it was a disturbance. The circular logic was astounding. So what you're saying is that any time you personally can hear something from your house, that's automatically a violation. I'm saying that if you wish to continue having these fire pit gatherings, you need to submit a request form to the board at least 2 weeks in advance. We meet monthly to review such requests. 2 weeks in advance. For having friends over. That's the policy, Mr. Daniels. I didn't write the rules. I just enforced them. I strongly suspected she had indeed written the rules, or at least had a heavy hand in crafting them, but arguing seemed pointless. I thanked her for her time, hung up, and immediately pulled up the community covenants online. Reading through the document was an exercise in bureaucratic frustration. The CC and Articus for Riverside Heights were 47 pages long and covered everything from approved paint colors to the maximum height of decorative grasses. The section about outdoor gatherings was indeed as vague as Patricia had indicated, stating that residents must obtain approval for outdoor social gatherings that may create noise impacts to neighboring properties after sunset. The phrase, may create noise impacts, was doing a lot of work there. Technically, any gathering with more than one person may create some level of noise. The rule was written so broadly that it could be applied to basically anything Patricia wanted to complain about. I spent the next hour researching HOA law in Colorado. What I found was simultaneously enlightening and depressing. HOAs in Colorado have significant power, but they're also bound by state law to be reasonable and follow their own governing documents. The problem was that reasonable is subjective, and enforcing your rights against an HOA usually meant hiring a lawyer and going through expensive mediation or litigation. Still, I wasn't ready to just roll over. I liked my fire pit gatherings. They were one of the main reasons I'd bought this house. So I decided to try the official route first. I found the request form Patricia had mentioned buried on the HOA's website, filled it out for a gathering the following Friday, and submitted it. The board's monthly meeting was the following Wednesday. I received an email the next day informing me that my request had been denied. No explanation was provided beyond a reference to the same Section 8, Paragraph 2, that Patricia had already cited. When I called to ask for a more detailed explanation, I got voicemail. My message was never returned. This was when I started to get annoyed. I'm generally a go-along-to-get-along kind of person, but the arbitrary nature of this situation grated on me. I was being denied the ability to use my own backyard for quiet, reasonable socializing because one busybody neighbor had decided she didn't like it. I decided to test the boundaries. That Friday, I invited the same group of friends over again. This time, I was meticulous about keeping noise levels down. We talked quietly, kept the music off entirely, and made sure nobody got rowdy. I even downloaded a decibel meter app on my phone and periodically checked that we were staying below normal conversation levels. At 9:45, Patricia appeared in my backyard. She didn't knock on the front door or call first. She just walked through my side gate and into my private property. "Excuse me, what are you doing?" I stood up from my chair. "Mr. Daniels, I've already warned you about these unauthorized gatherings. I'm here to document this violation." She held up her phone and took several photos of my friends and the fire pit. "You're trespassing," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "As HOA president, I have the authority to inspect properties for covenant violations. Not without notice, you don't, and not when the alleged violation is happening in my private backyard. Please leave. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the board. You're now facing potential fines of up to $500 per violation." One of my friends, Marcus, stood up. "Lady, we're sitting around a fire. We're not throwing a rave. This is insane." Patricia's face flushed. "Who are you?" "I'm someone who doesn't live here, which means I can tell you what everyone else is probably thinking. You're on a power trip, and you need to leave this man's property before he calls the cops for trespassing. I'll be adding a notation about hostile guests to my report," Patricia said, then turned and walked back out through the gate. The mood was effectively killed. My friends stuck around for another hour out of solidarity, but the evening had lost its relaxed vibe. After they left, I sat alone by the dying fire and tried to figure out what my next move should be. The formal complaint arrived 3 days later, along with a notice of a $500 fine. The complaint was itemized: unauthorized gathering after sunset, excessive noise disturbance, hostile behavior toward HOA representative performing official duties, and failure to comply with previous warnings. That last one pushed me over the edge. I wasn't going to pay this fine. Instead, I scheduled a consultation with a real estate attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Her name was Jennifer, and her office was in downtown Boulder. She listened to my whole story, reviewed the documents I'd brought, and leaned back in her chair with a knowing expression. "You're not the first person Patricia Whitmore has targeted," Jennifer said. "I've had 3 other clients from Riverside Heights in the past 2 years. She's selective about who she goes after, usually newcomers who she thinks will either comply immediately or won't fight back." "So what are my options?" "Legally, you have several. First, she absolutely cannot enter your property without notice and without a legitimate inspection purpose. Taking photos of you and your guests for a noise violation doesn't qualify. That's trespassing, and you could potentially file a police report. Second, the fine itself is questionable. $500 is the maximum allowed under your CC and Articus, but it's supposed to be reserved for serious, repeat violations. A first-time noise complaint shouldn't trigger the maximum fine. So I can fight this. You can. It'll require formal dispute resolution, probably mediation. The HOA will likely back down once they realize you've lawyered up, but it might cost you a few thousand in legal fees to get there." I left her office feeling validated but also frustrated. I was right, but being right was going to be expensive and time-consuming. And even if I won this particular battle, Patricia would still be HOA president, still 3 doors down, still watching my house for the next thing to complain about. That night, sitting in my living room with a beer and my laptop, I decided on a different approach. If Patricia wanted to play games with technicalities and rules, I could do that too. But I'd do it in a way that was so absurd, so perfectly compliant with her ridiculous standards, that it would make a point. The idea came to me fully formed, like a gift from the petty gods of suburban warfare. If the issue was noise, I'd eliminate the noise. Completely. I'd host gatherings that were so quiet, so perfectly silent, that Patricia couldn't possibly complain. But I'd make sure everyone in the neighborhood knew what I was doing and why. I spent the next day planning what I started calling the silent marshmallow roast. The concept was simple. I'd invite people over for a normal fire pit gathering, but nobody would be allowed to speak. At all. We'd roast marshmallows, make s'mores, and communicate entirely through written notes, gestures, and sign language. I created a Facebook event and invited not just my close friends, but every neighbor in Riverside Heights I could find on social media. The description read, "Join me for an absolutely silent evening around the fire. Due to HOA noise regulations, this will be a completely soundless gathering. Communication via written notes only. Let's see how quiet we can make a party." I posted about it in the Riverside Heights community Facebook group too, with a detailed explanation of why I was doing this. I was careful not to directly attack Patricia, just laid out the facts. I'd been cited for noise violations for normal conversation. I'd been threatened with fines. And so now, I was hosting a gathering that would be impossible to cite for noise, because there would be no noise whatsoever. The post went viral within the community. Within 24 hours, I had over 60 comments and more than 20 people confirmed for the event. The responses ranged from supportive to outright enthusiastic. Several people shared their own stories of Patricia's overreach. Someone mentioned she'd cited them for having their porch light on too late. Another person said she'd complained about the color of their doormat. The more stories I read, the more I realized this wasn't really about me. Patricia had been running Riverside Heights like her personal fiefdom, and people were tired of it. My silent protest had touched a nerve. Friday evening arrived with perfect weather. Crisp October air, clear skies, and a slight breeze. I set up the fire pit, arranged chairs in a large circle, and put out supplies. Marshmallows, chocolate, graham crackers, and stacks of small notebooks with pens. I made a large sign that I posted at the entrance to my backyard. "Welcome to the silent marshmallow roast. Please maintain complete silence throughout the evening. Write notes to communicate." People started arriving at 6:30. First came the Hendersons from next door, the elderly couple who I'd barely spoken to since moving in. Mrs. Henderson gave me a thumbs up and took a seat without saying a word. Then came the young family from the other side, parents and kids all holding their notebooks like sacred texts. Marcus and my other college friends arrived, along with at least 15 people I'd never met before but who had seen the Facebook event. By 7, I had roughly 30 people in my backyard, all sitting silently around the fire pit. It was surreal. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the rustle of wind through the trees, and the scratch of pens on paper as people wrote notes to each other. Someone passed me a note. "This is the weirdest party I've ever been to, and I kind of love it." I wrote back, "Wait until Patricia shows up." She did, of course. At 7:20, right as the sun was setting and the fire was really getting going, Patricia Whitmore appeared at my gate. This time she didn't enter the property. She stood at the fence line, phone out, clearly recording. 30 silent people turned to look at her. Several people held up their notebooks showing messages like, "Hi, Patricia." And so quiet. One person drew a smiley face and waved. Patricia's face cycled through several expressions: confusion, anger, realization, and finally a red-faced fury that she struggled to contain. She couldn't cite me for noise. There was no noise. Everyone was being perfectly, absolutely silent. She stood there for a solid 3 minutes, phone still up, trying to find something, anything to complain about. Finally, she turned and left without saying a word. The moment she disappeared from view, my backyard erupted in silent laughter. People were shaking with suppressed giggles, writing rapid-fire notes to each other about what had just happened. Someone passed me a note that read, "The look on her face was worth everything." We maintained the silence for another 2 hours. Kids ran around playing silent tag. Adults roasted marshmallows and assembled s'mores with exaggerated pantomime gestures. Someone started a game where we had to act out movies silently, and others guessed by writing down titles. It was actually fun in a strange performance art kind of way. Around 9:30, people started heading home. Everyone gave me silent hugs, thumbs up, and handed me notes thanking me for the evening and for standing up to Patricia. The Hendersons were the last to leave. Mr. Henderson, who I'd never heard speak before, broke the silence as they reached the gate. "That was the most fun I've had in this neighborhood in 5 years," he said. "Patricia's been after us twice for our wind chimes being too loud. Wind chimes. Thank you for this." After everyone left, I sat alone by the fire, scrolling through my phone. The Riverside Heights Facebook group was exploding with posts about the silent Marshmallow Roast. People were sharing photos, videos, and stories. The consensus seemed to be that the event was both hilarious and a much-needed statement against HOA overreach. Then, I saw Patricia's post. It had been made about an hour earlier, right after she'd left my property. "It has come to my attention that a certain resident is attempting to mock and undermine the HOA board's legitimate authority. These juvenile antics do not change the fact that unauthorized gatherings violate our community covenants. The board will be discussing further action at our next meeting." The comments under her post were not what she'd hoped for. Person after person called her out, asking why she was so focused on harassing Nathan Daniels when his gathering was completely silent and peaceful. Several people questioned whether she was abusing her position. One person formally called for a special election to replace the board. That comment got over 40 likes. I realized I might have started something bigger than just a personal protest. This was turning into a full-blown HOA rebellion. The next morning, Saturday, I was drinking coffee on my front porch when a local news van pulled up to my house. A reporter and cameraman got out, and the reporter waved to me. "Nathan Daniels. I'm Cheryl Martinez from Channel 9 News. We heard about your silent protest last night, and we'd love to do a story. Do you have a few minutes?" I almost choked on my coffee. "How did you hear about it?" "It's all over social media. Silent Marshmallow Roast is trending locally. People think it's hilarious and also an important statement about HOA overreach." This was escalating quickly, but I figured if I was going to make a point, I might as well make it publicly. I agreed to the interview. Cheryl asked me to explain the whole situation from the beginning. I walked her through buying the house, the initial fire pit gatherings, Patricia's complaints, the fine, and finally the decision to host a completely silent evening. The cameraman got footage of my fire pit and backyard. "So what's your ultimate goal here?" Cheryl asked. "Are you trying to get the HOA rules changed?" "I think the rules should be reasonable," I said. "Right now, they're written so broadly that they can be applied to anything the HOA president personally doesn't like. That's not fair to homeowners. We should be able to use our property for normal, quiet activities without facing fines or harassment." "Have you had any communication with Patricia Whitmore since last night?" No, but I saw her Facebook post. She seems to think this is about undermining her authority. Really, it's about pushing back against rules that don't make sense. The interview aired on the evening news. They actually made it a pretty substantial segment, including interviews with other Riverside Heights residents who spoke about their experiences with Patricia and the HOA. The Hendersons were featured, talking about the wind chime incident. Someone else discussed being fined for parking their own car in their own driveway overnight because it allegedly violated aesthetic standards. The piece ended with Cheryl noting that several residents were now calling for HOA board elections and reform. By Sunday morning, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets and several national websites that cover HOA horror stories. My phone was flooded with messages from friends, family, and strangers offering support or sharing their own HOA nightmare stories. I also received an email from the Riverside Heights HOA board, sent to all residents, calling for a special community meeting to be held the following Thursday evening at the local rec center. The email, signed by Patricia, stated that the meeting would address ongoing community concerns and recent violations. The tone was ominous, and I suspected Patricia was planning to make an example of me in front of everyone. That Thursday, I arrived at the rec center at 6:45 for the 7 o'clock meeting. The parking lot was already packed, way more cars than I'd expected. Inside, the community room was set up with rows of chairs facing a table at the front where Patricia and two other board members sat. I recognized one as a middle-aged man named Gregory who I'd met briefly at a neighborhood barbecue over the summer. The other was a woman named Susan, who I'd never spoken to. Every seat was filled, and people were standing along the walls. I counted at least 80 residents, which had to be more than half the neighborhood. Patricia looked surprised and not pleased by the turnout. I found a seat in the third row. Marcus had come for moral support and sat next to me. Patricia called the meeting to order at 7 sharp. Thank you all for coming. Before we begin with the formal agenda, I want to address the elephant in the room. Recent social media posts and news coverage have painted this HOA board in an unfairly negative light. We are volunteers who dedicate our time to maintaining property values and community standards. We do not deserve to be mocked or undermined. A hand shot up in the back. Patricia ignored it. The board has been made aware of multiple covenant violations by Mr. Nathan Daniels, including unauthorized gatherings, noise disturbances, and failure to comply with board directives. Tonight, we will be voting on whether to pursue formal legal action to enforce these violations and collect owed fines. Now multiple hands were up. Patricia continued to ignore them. Additionally, we will be discussing amendments to our noise ordinance to close loopholes that certain residents have attempted to exploit. Point of order. Someone shouted from the middle of the room. It was Mr. Henderson. According to our bylaws, community members have the right to speak during board meetings. You can't just ignore everyone. Patricia's jaw tightened. There will be time for public comment after the board discussion. No, said a woman I didn't recognize, standing up. According to the bylaws, public comment comes first. I have a copy right here. She held up a printed document. Patricia looked at Gregory and Susan for support, but both of them appeared uncomfortable. Gregory leaned over and whispered something to Patricia. She listened, then nodded stiffly. Fine. Public comment is now open. Please keep remarks brief and relevant. The floodgates opened. Person after person stood up to speak, and the overwhelming majority were critical of Patricia and the board's enforcement practices. People shared stories about petty citations, unreasonable fines, and what they saw as selective enforcement based on who Patricia liked or didn't like. One man stood up and said, "I've lived here for 8 years. In that time, I've watched this HOA become increasingly aggressive in policing minor issues while ignoring real problems. We have potholes in our streets that haven't been fixed in 2 years, but Patricia has time to cite Nathan for having friends over. That's not leadership, that's harassment." The room erupted in applause. A woman in the front row stood. "I want to know how much the board has spent on legal fees in the past 3 years pursuing violations, compared to how much we've spent on actual community improvements." Patricia shuffled papers. "That information is available in our financial reports." "I've read the financial reports," the woman shot back. "We've spent over $40,000 on attorneys. For what? To fine people for having their trash cans out 15 minutes too long." More applause. Then it was my turn. I stood up, and the room quieted. "I didn't move to Riverside Heights planning to become the face of HOA reform," I said. "I just wanted to enjoy my backyard." But what I've learned over the past few weeks is that a lot of people in this community feel bullied and controlled by leadership that's supposed to be serving us, not ruling over us. I hosted a silent marshmallow roast because it seemed like the only way to comply with noise complaints about normal conversation. The fact that we're here tonight, arguing about whether friends can talk in someone's backyard, shows how absurd this has become. The applause was deafening. Patricia looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. Gregory, the other board member, cleared his throat. "I think we need to acknowledge that perhaps enforcement has been inconsistent. I'd like to propose that we table the discussion about fines for Mr. Daniels and instead form a committee to review our current policies." Susan nodded quickly. "I second that." Patricia looked betrayed. "We can't just ignore violations." "We're not ignoring anything," Gregory said firmly. "We're taking time to assess whether our enforcement approach is reasonable and in line with community standards. Frankly, Patricia, the news coverage and community response should tell us we've gotten off track." The vote was 2-1 to table enforcement action against me and form a review committee. Patricia cast the only dissenting vote. The meeting continued for another hour, covering routine business, but the real drama was over. As people filed out, dozens stopped to shake my hand or thank me. The Hendersons invited me to dinner the following week. Marcus was grinning. "You just won," he said. "Maybe," I replied, "but Patricia's still HOA president." That situation resolved itself faster than I expected. The following Monday, I received an email informing me that Patricia Whitmore had resigned from the HOA board, effective immediately. No explanation was given in the official notice, but the neighborhood gossip filled in the gaps quickly. Apparently, after the disastrous community meeting, Gregory and Susan had approached Patricia privately and suggested she step down before things got worse. There was already a petition circulating to recall the entire board, and Patricia's name was specifically mentioned. Rather than face a public recall election, she'd chosen to resign. Gregory was named interim president and immediately sent out a community-wide email announcing that the Policy Review Committee would begin meeting next week and that all residents were welcome to participate. He also announced that formal enforcement action on minor violations would be suspended pending the review. I volunteered for the committee, along with about 15 other residents. Over the next month, we met weekly to go through the CC and Articus section by section, discussing what made sense, what was too restrictive, and what needed clarification. The noise ordinance was one of the first things we tackled. The committee unanimously agreed that the old language was too vague, and gave too much power to individual board members to make subjective decisions. We rewrote it to specify actual quiet hours, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. on weekdays, midnight to 8 a.m. on weekends, and defined noise violations as sustained noise above a specific decibel level measured from the property line. Casual outdoor gatherings during reasonable hours were explicitly protected. We also limited the HOA's ability to enter private property without notice and established a formal, transparent appeals process for anyone who received a violation notice or fine. The revised CC and Articles were presented to the community in December, and the vote to adopt them was nearly unanimous. The only no vote came from Patricia Whitmore, who attended the meeting but didn't speak. Elections for a new HOA board were held in January. I didn't run for a position, but several of the people from the review committee did. The new board was much more representative of the community's actual values. Reasonable enforcement of rules that genuinely protected property values and quality of life, but no more petty harassment over minor issues. As winter settled in, I continued hosting gatherings around my fire pit. They weren't silent anymore. People talked, laughed, and occasionally got a little loud, especially when someone told a particularly good story. Nobody complained. Patricia never reached out to me, and after a while, I stopped seeing her at community events altogether. Eventually, I heard she'd moved out of Riverside Heights entirely, selling her house and relocating to a different development in Denver. I felt a bit of sympathy for her, in a strange way. I think Patricia genuinely believed she was protecting the community and maintaining standards. The problem was that her standards were unreasonable and arbitrarily enforced, and she'd let the small amount of power go to her head. It's a cautionary tale about homeowner associations. They can be useful for managing shared resources and maintaining basic standards, but they can also become vehicles for petty tyranny if the wrong people end up in charge. One Friday evening in late February, nearly 5 months after the first silent Marshmallow Roast, I hosted another themed gathering. This one was called the Loud Marshmallow Roast, and the whole point was to be as cheerfully noisy as reasonably possible. We had music playing, people telling stories in deliberately dramatic voices, and lots of laughter. It was a celebration of the fact that we could now use our backyards like normal human beings without fear of harassment. The new HOA president, a friendly woman named Diana who lived 2 streets over, even stopped by for a bit. She roasted a marshmallow, chatted for a while, and then headed home with a smile and a wave. No clipboard, no citations, no threats, just a neighbor being neighborly. That night, sitting by the fire with friends and neighbors after Deanna left, someone asked me if I regretted the whole conflict with Patricia. I thought about it for a moment before answering. No, I said. It was stressful and frustrating, but it led to real change. This whole neighborhood is better off now because we pushed back. And honestly, the silent marshmallow roast was kind of fun in its own weird way. Are you going to host another one? Marcus asked. Maybe as an annual thing, I said, like a reminder of where we started and how far we've come. Everyone liked that idea. So the silent marshmallow roast became a Riverside Heights tradition, held every October. It's ironic, I guess, that something born from conflict and petty HOA enforcement became a beloved community event. But maybe that's the best possible outcome, turning something negative into something that brings people together. The rest of that winter and into spring, life in Riverside Heights was remarkably peaceful. The new HOA board focused on actual community improvements, getting those potholes fixed, organizing neighborhood cleanup days, and improving the common areas. Enforcement of CC and Artiques was fair and reasonable. When violations occurred, people received friendly notices with opportunities to correct issues before any fines were imposed. I continued my regular fire pit gatherings, now without any stress or fear of citation. The fire pit became something of a neighborhood hub. People would often drop by on Friday evenings, knowing they'd find good company and conversation. The Hendersons became regular attendees, and I learned that Mrs. Henderson made incredible homemade brownies that she'd bring to share. In March, I got an email from Cheryl Martinez, the reporter who'd covered the original silent Marshmallow Roast story. She wanted to do a follow-up piece about how things had changed in Riverside Heights. I agreed, and she came out for an interview. We sat in my backyard, the fire pit cold in the afternoon light, and I told her about the policy changes, the new board, and the transformation of the community dynamic. "So would you say the silent marshmallow roast was worth it?" she asked. "Absolutely," I said. It was a silly protest, but it got people's attention and started a conversation that needed to happen. Sometimes you have to do something dramatic to wake people up. The follow-up story aired as a feel-good segment about community activism and positive change. It got picked up by a few websites, and once again, I was briefly internet famous in the niche world of HOA reform. But the real reward wasn't the attention. It was the simple fact that I could use my own backyard without harassment. It was the friendships I'd formed with neighbors through this whole process. It was knowing that other people in Riverside Heights felt empowered to speak up about problems instead of just accepting them. One particularly memorable evening in April, I was out by the fire pit with about 8 people, including the Hendersons, Marcus, and a few other neighbors who'd become regulars. Someone brought up the silent marshmallow roast, and we started sharing stories about that night. I'll never forget Patricia's face when she showed up, and everyone was just sitting there in complete silence, Mr. Henderson said, laughing. She looked like her brain was short-circuiting. "My favorite part was watching the kids try to play tag without making any noise," said Karen, one of the neighborhood moms. "They were so serious about it." "I think my favorite part," I said, "was realizing how many people were dealing with the same frustration I was. I thought I was alone in this fight, but it turned out the whole neighborhood was tired of the same thing." "You gave everyone permission to speak up," Mrs. Henderson said. "That was the real gift." As spring turned to summer, Riverside Heights continued to thrive under the new board's leadership. The community felt different now. More relaxed, more friendly, more like an actual community instead of a collection of houses governed by arbitrary rules. In June, the neighborhood organized its first ever community barbecue at the rec center. Over 100 people attended, including families with kids, elderly couples, and everyone in between. It was the kind of event that Patricia probably would have tried to micromanage into joyless compliance, but under the new leadership, it was just a fun, casual gathering. I helped man one of the grills, flipping burgers and hot dogs while chatting with neighbors I'd gotten to know over the past months. Gregory, the former interim president who'd helped push for reform, stopped by the grill. "You know, Nathan, I owe you an apology," he said. "For what?" "For not standing up to Patricia sooner. I knew her enforcement was getting out of hand, but I didn't want the conflict. It took you making a public stand for the rest of us to find our courage." "We all did what we could," I said. "The important thing is it worked out. Still, thank you. This neighborhood is a better place because you didn't just roll over." That summer was one of the best I'd ever experienced. My backyard fire pit saw constant use. I hosted birthday parties, casual hangouts, and even helped organize a neighborhood movie night where we set up a projector screen in my yard and showed classic films while people sat around the fire. Every gathering was properly loud, properly fun, and properly legal under the revised CC and Artiques. No citations, no complaints, no drama, just neighbors being neighbors. In late August, something unexpected happened. I received a letter in the mail, handwritten on nice stationery. The return address showed it was from Patricia Whitmore, though her address was now in Denver. I opened it with curiosity and a bit of caution. The letter was short. Dear Nathan, I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to reach out to apologize for my behavior during your first months in Riverside Heights. I've spent the past several months in therapy working through some personal issues, and I've come to realize that I used my position in the HOA to exert control in unhealthy ways. This doesn't excuse my actions, but I hope it explains them to some degree. You were trying to enjoy your home, and I made that difficult for no good reason. I'm sorry. I've heard that the neighborhood has made positive changes since I left, and I'm genuinely glad for that. I hope you're enjoying your fire pit gatherings. Patricia. I read the letter twice, then showed it to Marcus when he came over that evening. Wow, he said. That's not what I expected. Me neither, I admitted. Are you going to write back? I thought about it. Part of me wanted to just leave the past in the past. But another part recognized that it took courage for Patricia to write that letter, especially when she didn't have to. I wrote back. I kept it brief, thanked her for the apology, wished her well in Denver, and told her that I held no hard feelings. I meant it too. Patricia had made my life difficult for a while, but the end result was positive change for an entire community. In a weird way, she'd been a catalyst for something good. As autumn approached again, nearly a year after my first fire pit gathering in Riverside Heights, I started planning the second annual silent Marshmallow Roast. This time, it wasn't a protest. It was a celebration and a reminder of where we'd been. The Facebook event went up in September, and the response was overwhelming. Over 70 people confirmed attendance. Local news reached out asking if they could cover it. I said yes, figuring it would be a nice follow-up to their original story. The evening of the second silent Marshmallow Roast was perfect. Cool October air, clear skies, and the smell of autumn leaves. My backyard was packed with people, all committed to maintaining complete silence for the evening. We'd upgraded our communication system this year. Several people brought small whiteboards and dry erase markers for easier note passing. Channel 9 sent Cheryl Martinez again. She arrived with her cameraman and filmed the surreal scene of 70 silent people roasting marshmallows and communicating through notes and gestures. She interviewed me on camera, and I explained how this tradition had started as a protest, but had evolved into a celebration of community and positive change. So what's the lesson in all this? Cheryl asked. What would you say to other people dealing with difficult HOA situations? Don't just accept it, I said. You have rights as a homeowner, and HOAs are supposed to serve the community, not rule over it. If something seems unreasonable, it probably is. Speak up, get organized, and push for change. And sometimes, a little creative protest can make your point better than any argument. The segment aired that weekend, and once again made the rounds online. The silent Marshmallow Roast became a minor internet phenomenon, with articles calling it the most wholesome protest ever and how to fight your HOA with kindness. But for me and my neighbors, it was just a fun evening and a reminder of how far we'd come. As the evening wound down and people started heading home, breaking their silence with laughter and conversation as they reached the street, I sat by the fire with Marcus and the Hendersons. You know what's funny? Mrs. Henderson said, speaking quietly now that most people had left. "A year ago, I would never have imagined being friends with you, Nathan. We kept to ourselves. We didn't go to neighborhood events. Patricia had cited us so many times that we just tried to be invisible." "And now?" I asked. "Now we're here at least once a week. We know half the neighborhood. We actually enjoy living here again. You did that." "We all did that," I corrected. "I just started the conversation." "Well, we're grateful regardless," Mr. Henderson said. "After everyone left, I stayed by the fire alone for a while, watching the flames die down to embers. I thought about everything that had happened over the past year. The stress, the conflict, the organizing, the changes, and ultimately the victory. I'd bought this house because I wanted a place of my own, a backyard where I could relax and enjoy life. I'd ended up getting that, but also so much more. A real community, genuine friendships, and the satisfaction of knowing I'd made a difference. The fire pit, which had started all of this, sat quietly in the center of my yard, its stones warm from the evening's fire. It was just an object, just a ring of rocks and metal, but it had become a symbol of something larger. The right to enjoy your home, the importance of standing up to unreasonable authority, and the power of community when people work together. As I headed inside that night, I looked back at the fire pit one more time. Tomorrow was Saturday, and I'd already gotten texts from 3 different neighbors asking if I was going to have a fire going in the evening. I'd said yes, of course. There would always be a fire, always be friends, always be conversation and laughter. But there would also be that memory of the silent marshmallow roast, that absurd and perfect protest that changed everything. Sometimes the best way to fight noise complaints is with silence. Sometimes the best way to push back against control is with creative compliance. And sometimes the most effective revolution is one that brings people together over marshmallows and a warm fire. Life in Riverside Heights continued peacefully through the rest of that fall and into winter. The HOA remained reasonable and focused on actual community improvement. My fire pit gatherings became a beloved neighborhood institution. And somewhere in Denver, I hoped Patricia Whitmore was finding her own peace. As for me, I was just happy to be home in my backyard with my fire pit and my friends. It was everything I'd wanted when I bought this house, and I'd fought to keep it. That fight was worth it. Every silent marshmallow, every reformed policy, every new friendship was worth it. The silent marshmallow roast taught me something important. You don't have to be loud to make your voice heard. Sometimes the quietest protest makes the biggest statement. And sometimes the best revenge against petty authority isn't anger or aggression, but creativity, community, and the simple act of refusing to let others control how you live your life. 1 year later, sitting around that same fire pit with people who'd become genuine friends, I could say with certainty that I'd made the right choice in fighting back. My backyard was mine again. My home was truly home. And Riverside Heights was a real community, not just a collection of houses governed by fear and arbitrary rules. That's what one fire pit, some marshmallows, and a commitment to absolutely absurd silence had achieved. Not bad for a Tuesday evening that started with a simple complaint about noise.